Hello, hello. Welcome to chapter 14. In this chapter, we are going to learn more about the blood. So, as you should have noticed by now, there is a list of medical terminology at the beginning of each chapter. You should make yourself extremely familiar with these terms at the beginning of the chapter so that as we go through the chapter, you can learn them better and you can have an easier time understanding the concepts in this chapter. Some of the things we're going to learn in this chapter, we're going to learn the different types of RBCs. RBC stands for red blood cells. We're going to learn about the different types of WBCs or white blood cells. We will learn about what is a blood cell count. So those of you that are going into clinical practice, you'll understand the importance, at least the overall importance of a blood cell count for both red blood cells and white blood cells. You'll learn the different types of anemia, and we'll talk about platelets as well as plasma, or the liquid portion of blood. So just as an introduction, blood is considered a connective tissue. So if you remember in chapter 5, when we talked about the different types of human tissues, we talked about blood as being one of the connective tissues. Connective tissues, if you remember, are those tissues that are most widely found throughout the body. They are most abundant in the body, and they are most diverse in the body. So this is the type of tissue that is one part of it is very liquid, like blood, and then you have all the way to the extremely hard, which is bone and everything in between. Jobs of blood are to transport vital substances. So this may be nutrients, this could be oxygen, this could be waste products, this can be hormones. Anything that needs to get from one place to another in the body is usually transported within blood. Blood also helps to maintain the stability of the interstitial fluid. Make sure you pause here to look up interstitial fluid if you don't know what that means already. Blood has the job of distributing heat. And so those are the functions of blood itself. Now we talk about blood cells. Blood cells are the formed elements or the cells within the blood. Remember that blood is also including the plasma. So blood cells are mostly made in the red bone marrow. You have red blood cells, which are abbreviated RBCs. You have white blood cells, which are abbreviated WBCs. And you have platelets, which are actually not cells. They are fragments of cells that have a particular purpose. So instead of saying formed cells in blood, we usually say formed elements, partly because platelets are not full cells. They are fragments of cells. The amount of blood that is located within an individual's body depends on the size of that person. For example, you wouldn't have the same amount of blood as an infant. The changes in fluid concentration, for example, if a person is dehydrated versus a person that is well hydrated, those amounts of blood in that same person in those different states will be somewhat different. Changes in electrolyte concentration. When you change the concentrations of electrolytes, you change the concentrations of water and other fluids in the body. For example, remember when I told you all that where sodium goes in the body, so does water follow. So if you have higher amounts of sodium in the bloodstream, then you're going to have a higher volume of water in the bloodstream, because any of the water that's in the body is going to be drawn into the bloodstream because of the amount of sodium. Also, if your sodium levels decrease greatly because your electrolytes are shifting, decrease in sodium amounts will decrease the amount of water, will decrease the amount of blood in the cardiovascular system. So all of those, plus the amount of adipose tissue that a person has, will change the amount of blood that a person has in their body. Blood is about 8% of the body weight. So if a person is 150 pounds, 10% of that is 15 pounds. So just under 15 pounds of their body weight will be that volume of blood in a person that weighs 150 pounds. The volume of adult blood is about 5 liters. So if you think about a 1 liter Coke, 5 of those is approximately how much blood an adult human has. When you look at this image, the thing on this image that I really want you to see is this, the centrifuged blood sample. So this is a test tube. And what happens is they took this sample of whole blood, they did a blood draw, drew the blood into a test tube, and then they took that blood and they put it in a centrifuge. So the centrifuge is a machine that the lab uses to spin the blood really fast. And when they spin the blood, that helps the blood separate according to weight. Once it's done, what you'll see is you have this liquid portion at the top because it is the lightest. Then you have this white portion that they call the Buffy coat. The white portion has your white blood cells and your platelets, and it sits just underneath the liquid portion because it is heavier than the liquid, but it's lighter than the next part, the red blood cells. The red blood cells are going to be found closer to the bottom because they are the heaviest or most dense of the 3 different parts of blood. So that is where the red blood cells are going to be held. And like I said, this is fresh whole blood that has been centrifuged to be separated by weight. This is the same thing. So a capillary tube is just another really small tube. And instead of using a capillary tube in a centrifuge, what usually happens is they draw the blood and they just kind of let it sit and separate on its own according to weight. So what we notice here is that you have the separations of plasma, that Buffy coat of white blood cells and platelets in the middle, and then your red blood cells at the bottom. This separation happens naturally in gravity. It's just that with the centrifuge, it goes faster, but with the capillary tube, they just sit it on the side and let gravity move every piece of blood to where it needs to go, and that's how you get this separation. So blood volume by volume. 55% of the blood in your body is plasma. So that liquid portion of blood, 55% of the total blood volume is that liquid portion or that plasma. The Buffy coat has less than 1%. And then you have the rest is red blood cells, which is 45% of the total blood volume that comes out of your body. Looking at the composition of blood more specifically, make sure that you are looking at this chart to understand it, but you have whole blood here. Whole blood is divided into 2 pieces. You have your formed elements. Remember, the formed elements are the cells or the cell fragments in the blood. And then you have the plasma. That's the liquid portion of blood. So in the formed elements, you have the platelets, which are 4.8%, so less than 5% of your total blood volume. You have red blood cells, which are 95% of your formed elements. And then you have white blood cells, which are 0.1 or less than 1%, 0.1% of your total formed blood volume. Now, within your plasma, the makeup of plasma is like this. So 92% of this plasma is going to be water. approximately 7%. So the rest of it, for the most part, are going to be proteins. Then with that rest, the other 1% of plasma volume, you're going to have things like electrolytes. You're going to have your waste products. You're going to have other nutrients, vitamins, and hormones. And then you'll have gases like your oxygen and carbon dioxide. And your proteins are broken down into these different types of proteins, which have completely different functions. Fibrinogen has function in blood clotting. Globulins have function in your immune system. And albumin is a necessary protein that's used for a lot of other things in the body. And these are the different types of white blood cells. So you have different types of white blood cells throughout your body. So the formed elements, remember the formed elements are your cells or cell parts. So these are the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Blood cells originate in red bone marrow from hemocytoblasts. Hemo means blood, cyto means cell, blasts build. Or hematopoietic cells, stem cells, which go through a process called hematopoiesis. Make sure you're looking up this term, hematopoiesis, hematopoietic, and hemocytoblasts. Stem cells can then give rise to more stem cells, so you can have more of these cells that can become anything once stem cells divide into more stem cells, or those stem cells can start to differentiate into different cells that have different jobs within the within the blood cell family. Depending on which hormones or growth factors are presented to them at that time. So characteristics of red blood cells. First of all, red blood cells are also called erythrocytes. Erythro meaning red, cyte meaning cell. The cells are biconcave discs. So bi means two, concave means that the cells fold in on each other. So when you look at the cell and it kind of goes in, that invagination is a concave shape. And notice that it has the exact same shape on the other side. So this plus this gives us biconcave shape. Because it has this shape and because the cells are extremely flexible, these red blood cells are very able to squeeze through capillaries. Some of these capillaries are extremely small. So your red blood cells have to actually pass through the capillary in a single filed line so that it's just red blood cells stacked behind red blood cell going through the capillary at that time. And sometimes your red blood cell has to actually fold over on itself in order for the cell to get from one place to another. And because it has this biconcave shape, it's able to fold over on itself. Red blood cells lack a nucleus, meaning that your red blood cell does not have genetic material. Your mature red blood cell does not have genetic material in it. That's what lends the cell to this biconcave shape, because you don't have a nucleus located in this area to sort of fill the cell out. And because it lacks a nucleus, it can lend itself to this biconcave shape. Red blood cells do have a nucleus early in development, but as the cells mature, once the cell has matured, the nucleus disintegrates, it leaves the cell. So side note, if you are looking at blood cell count and you notice that there are red blood cells that have a nucleus in it, then you know that something is going on with that person, because the body is sending immature red blood cells to the bloodstream for general circulation. That does happen for many people, and that is a telltale sign that something is happening where the body has to send blood cells into the bloodstream before the cells have matured. The mature cells, because they're biconcave, because they don't have a nucleus, now has more space for hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the portion of red blood cells that is responsible for carrying oxygen from one place to another. So the more space they have for carrying oxygen, for this hemoglobin that carries oxygen, the more oxygen it can get to other parts of the body. Red blood cells, mature red blood cells, cannot synthesize proteins, and they cannot divide because they don't have DNA. DNA's job is to help the cell divide and to synthesize certain proteins, and the proteins will depend on the function of that cell. But these cells, these mature cells, can't do either one of those things because they don't have a nucleus. So when you hear somebody talk about a blood count, get a blood cell count stat. You hear that in the movies occasionally, but a red blood cell count literally goes into the sample of blood that was given. The machine or the person will look at a drop of the blood under a microscope and literally count how many blood cells you find in a given area. And then they do all the math. They multiply it by the total volume of blood in the body. And that's how they can tell how many red blood cells or white blood cells a person has. So that is what a blood cell count is. A red blood cell count specifically will count the number of RBCs in a cubic millimeter or a microliter of blood. So remember I said they take a drop of blood, they put it on a microscope slide. It's a particular microscope slide that has these spaces etched in the slide. These spaces, these boxes will be measured as a cubic millimeter or as a microliter. And they can count how much of each how much of each blood cell type is located in those little boxes. How much red blood cell is in a microliter of blood or a cubic millimeter of blood depends on the person's age and the person's health, because that number can vary. It can be affected by both age and health. The typical ranges are 4.6 million to 6.2 million in males, 4.2 million to 5.4 million in adult females, and 4.5 million to 5.1 million in children. You don't have to remember those numbers in particular, be able to understand what those numbers represent. As you know, right, red blood cells reflect a blood's oxygen carrying capacity. So if a person has a lower amount of red blood cells and they are not carrying as much oxygen as they can, that person is either anemic or on their way to anemia. And remember, an means without. Emia has to do with blood. So the term itself means without blood. But what happens is they have lower amounts of blood, which means they have lesser ability to carry oxygen from the lungs to the other parts of the body. Red blood cell count will usually increase for several days following a strenuous workout, or is increased when you go to altitude. So in strenuous workout, remember that you are putting stress on the body. And your body, as I mentioned all the time, your body is extremely adaptable. That is what the body is supposed to do, adapt to its situation. So if you put the body in a situation where it needs more oxygen for a period of time, over the course of time, then your body is going to assume that it will continue to need more oxygen. And so because you're continuously doing the strenuous exercises, your red blood cell count will increase to compensate for the increase in need of oxygen so that you can make more ATP in your mitochondria within the cells. Also, when you move up to higher altitudes. So you go to higher altitudes, you already know that air is thinner in higher altitudes. And because the air is thinner, the body will produce more red blood cells to help it capture the little bit of oxygen that it does have to be able to feed the rest of the body oxygen so that it can make ATP. Low blood oxygen causes the kidneys and liver to release erythropoietin, which is also written as EPO. Erythropoietin then stimulates red blood cell production. So this is a type of negative feedback mechanism in the body. Remember, negative feedback is the most abundant feedback loop within the body. So the body notices low amounts of something, whatever it's monitoring. The low amount of that thing will stimulate production of something else. So low blood oxygen. This low blood oxygen will go to the liver and go to the kidneys. And in both of those, that will stimulate the production of erythropoietin. Erythro, again, meaning red, referring to red blood cells. Poietin talks about starting something, right? So erythropoietin is how we produce or form or start red blood cells. And so then erythropoietin will go into the bloodstream, it'll go into the red bone marrow to help increase the amount of red blood cells are floating around in the blood. And then once the amount of red blood cells increase, you no longer have a low blood oxygen level because it has increased its oxygen carrying capacity. And that will stop the production of erythropoietin because you no longer have this product. So this is negative feedback because the product of this feedback loop will eventually cause the stopping of the feedback loop. Within a few days, many new red blood cells will appear as circulating blood, and that's what this is. Some dietary factors that affect the production of red blood cells include B12 and folic acid. Both of these are necessary and required for DNA synthesis, which means that they are necessary for the growth and development of, the growth and division of all cells. So if a person has a deficiency in B12, they have a deficiency in folic acid, then they will not be able to make cells as necessary, or red blood cells as necessary. There is a type of anemia that is caused by a lack of B12 and folic acid. That is not iron deficiency anemia, that is B12 deficiency. All right, because it stops the blood from making red blood cells. Iron is also necessary for red blood cell production. It is required in synthesis of hemoglobin, which is the molecule that actually carries oxygen from one place to another. Vitamin C is necessary to increase the absorption of iron in the digestive tract. So if you are lacking iron, one of the ways that you can increase your iron production or iron absorption from food is to make sure that you have adequate vitamin C on board in your diet. Tannic acid will then reduce absorption of iron. So if you happen to be a person that has too much iron, then drinking things like tea, black tea, green tea, white tea, will increase the amount of tannic acid in your body, and that can reduce iron absorption. Please look at this on your own so that you can understand what is happening here. This shows you the different types of anemia. So these are the different names of the anemia. These are the different causes. So just because a person has anemia does not necessarily mean that they need the same treatment for that anemia. You'll learn that as you are a clinician, it is extremely important that you look at the person's blood labs to see what type of anemia they have. And you can easily see this once you learn what the different values in the blood cell count are, and what they are, so that you can know what type of anemia a person has. This defect, the defect that causes each of these can be this. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the only defect, but that is what this chart means. This is a visual. So this is what normal red blood cells look like. These little spots here. Well, these little spots look like they might be platelets. I know that when we looked at blood last semester, we didn't see this because our microscopes aren't powerful enough, but those little spots look like they may be platelets. And I'm not really sure, this may be either a platelet or a white, nope, that has to be a platelet. I was about to say a white blood cell, but white blood cells are bigger than red blood cells. So these, if they were white blood cells, they'd be much larger than these. As opposed to this, you can see how these cells are not as red. They look like they're thinner. They look like they're more fragile. They're not as many of them. This is what anemic blood looks like versus regular blood. So then you have to not only look at this blood sample to see that it is anemic, then you want to be able to look at the different causes so that you can know what type of anemia a person has, so that you can know how to treat that person. So read this portion on destruction of red blood cells so that you can see what all can cause the damage of red blood cells. And as you can see, there are many different things that can cause the destruction or damage of red blood cells themselves. So the different types of white blood cells. I'm gonna go back a second. When we started the chapter, and we looked at, so this is one example of it, but we're going to look at an easier chart. So when we looked at this, I showed you that this was your white blood cells. It makes up less than 1% of the formed elements in the blood, but it is divided into these 5 different types. These are all different types of white blood cells. And so because these are different types of white blood cells, when we talk about white blood cells, we can either talk about them as a whole, or we can talk about them individually. So I'll go back. All right. So overall, your white blood cells are called leukocytes. Leuko means white, cyte means cell. So that is an alternate name for white blood cells. White blood cells are a part of your immune system. They help protect you against disease, different types of disease. White blood cell hormones are interleukins and colony stimulating factors. These stimulate development. So white blood cells, the hormones that are associated with white blood cells are called interleukins, and there are some also called colony stimulating factors. There are 5 types of white blood cells, and these 5 white blood cells fall into 2 distinct categories. You have granulocytes and you have agranulocytes. So granulocytes, cyte means cell, granulo refers to grains, right? So either you have cells that have grains or cells that don't have grains. Remember, A at the front of a word means without. So granulocytes, cells with grains, or agranulocytes, cells without grains. The granulocytes are your neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Yes, you need to know the different names of these types of white blood cells. So you need to know these categories: granulocytes, agranulocytes, and the types of cells that falls underneath. In the agranulocytes, you have lymphocytes and monocytes. So the first of the cells, your neutrophils, are types of granulocytes. These are your light purple cells. So when you look at a blood smear, what you'll notice is a bunch of red blood cells. So most of the slide will be red blood cells in a person who is healthy. But then dispersed throughout, you'll see these larger cells that are more purple. And that purple color is not because the cell itself is purple. Obviously, it's white, right? Because it is a white blood cell. What turns it purple is the acid-base stain that is used in the fixing of the cells. So they stain the cells so that the cells can be more easily seen in on a slide. So the neutrophils have a lobed nucleus. So you know what lobes are. Lobes are like big hunks of material. So when you look at this white blood cell, you'll see you have this light purple all around. That is your cytosol or your cytoplasm. You have the spots inside of it. Many of those are your organelles, the little organs inside the cell that help it to do what it needs to do. And these big spots are your nucleus. So here, it looks like you have different lobes of your nucleus. So one lobe, one lobe, one lobe, one lobe, and then a tiny lobe. That is what it means when it says a lobed nucleus. This is a typical look for a neutrophil. Other names for neutrophils are SEGs. You have polymorphonuclear leukocyte, or PMN. We don't really say that a whole lot, but you may see PMN leukocyte. It's also called bands. So bands are young neutrophils. Remember in the last couple slides ago, I talked about when you do a red blood cell count and you look at red blood cells in the microscope, if you see a bunch of red blood cells that actually still have their nucleus, then you know something is going on in that person's body, because the bone marrow is putting immature red blood cells into circulation. Very similar to that is the concept of these bands. When you do a blood cell count and you're counting the neutrophils, if you see immature or young neutrophils, then those are called bands. And that can also tell you something about what's happening inside that person's body. Neutrophils are known to be the first to arrive at an infection. Very, very important to understand. Neutrophils are the first to arrive at an infection. Not all white blood cells have the same functions. This is why there are 5 different types. They have different functions, different stimuli, so they'll show up at different times when there are different things going on in the body. So if a person has a bacterial infection, then the neutrophils are going to increase. They're going to be more abundant in that area. Your neutrophils are phagocytic. Remember, phago means to eat. So these are the cells that eat things. So the phagocytes are the cells that's going to look around the area. And if they see something they don't like, especially an infection, they're going to start gobbling up those cells or that debris to help break it down, destroy it, and then remove it from the area. So neutrophils are the first to arrive at an infection, and these are phagocytic cells. More than 50%, so 54 to 62% of your white blood cell count is leukocyte, neutrophils. So of the total amount of white blood cells or leukocytes in a healthy person on a regular basis, any given day, you should have 54 to 62% of your white blood cell count be leukocytes. This amount, if you look at a blood cell count, if the neutrophils are more than 62% of your white blood cell count, then you know that person has a bacterial infection in their body. So being able to understand what the different types of white blood cells do so that you can understand what's going on inside the person is going to be helpful for you as a clinician, because again, even though the neutrophils are the most abundant white blood cell type within all leukocytes, if it is elevated beyond this amount, then you know that person has a bacterial infection. The next type of white blood cell that we look at, the other type of granulocyte, is going to be your eosinophil. So let me go back. Remember, these are granulocytes. So those little spots look like little grains, right? And so those are, this is part of what makes it a granulocyte, those grains. This one also has a bunch of dots or grains on it, which makes it also a granulocyte. In that acid stain, so remember here in the neutrophils, we use an acid-base stain in order to make it purple. Here, in the acid stain, it turns deep red. So when you look at it, you see mostly this deep red with a purple nucleus. And that is a typical look of an eosinophil. You know, eosinophil is bilobed. So we noticed that the neutrophils had said that it had a lobed nucleus. It had multiple lobes on the inside. Eosinophils are bilobed, bi meaning two. So it has two lobes. So two lobes of your nucleus in eosinophils. This eosinophil responds in an allergic reaction. It also responds in a parasitic infection. So if you look at a blood count within a person and you notice that their eosinophils are more than 1 to 3% of the total leukocyte count, then you can bet your bottom dollar that that person has either an allergy or a parasite infection. This is springtime, so the trees and the plants are starting to bloom. So many of us will have increased seasonal allergies because these eosinophils are elevated during allergy season. Those of you who are affected by seasonal allergies, you right now will have an increase in your leukocytes, in your eosinophils specifically, beyond this 3% of the leukocytes. So again, as these are elevated in both of these responses. So if a person has allergies, then they're going to be responsive. Their eosinophils are going to respond in that way. But if a person does not have allergies and their eosinophils are elevated, then you know that they have some kind of parasitic worm. So then you want to start asking questions like, have they traveled? Have they eaten raw meat? What have they noticed? What are the symptoms? Just to get more. But that is how you can tell whether or not a person has an allergic response to something or parasitic infection to something. Basophil. Basophil is the last type of granulocyte. So in the base part of the stain will cause this cell or the granules to become a deep blue. This cell is responsible for releasing histamine. So histamine, we know that we hear histamine talked about when we talk about allergies. It's also responsible for releasing heparin. Heparin is responsible for thinning the blood. So if a person has more than, or if they have 1% or more of their white blood cell count is actually basophil, then we know that this person is releasing histamine or heparin for some reason. All right. So they're similar to eosinophils in their size and in their shape, but they're not eosinophils, obviously. All right. Excuse me. So basophils release histamine. They also release heparin. They're supposed to be less than 1% of the total leukocyte volume. I'm going to stop this portion of the lecture here. We'll continue the blood lecture with the next type of white blood cell, which is an agranulocyte.